very, perhaps more powerful nation states set agendas, set discussions, duke it out, in fora, in negotiations, and situations of that sort and that caliber. Ambassador Gross has an extensive resume. He co-chairs Wiley Ryan's telecom media and technology practice as a law firm. He's one of the world's foremost experts on international telecommunications and internet policies, having addressed the UN General Assembly and led more US delegations to major international telecom conferences than anyone else in modern history. He's noted as bringing innovation and vision to the rapidly changing TMT industry.
This is a great commercial, by the way. This is terrific.
Unpaid. By Who's Who Legal, an entity. Ambassador Gross draws on more than 30 years of experience as a lawyer.
That means I'm old.
Global policymaker and corporate executive to assist US companies seeking to enter or expand their international businesses. He also advises non-US companies and industry organizations seeking to invest in, monitor, and understand the US and international markets, as well as national governments. Ambassador Gross advises companies and others on international, domestic telecoms, internet, high-tech strategy, focusing on both specific markets and international organizations like ITU, we've spoken about ITU, or OECD, we've touched a little bit on OECD, and others like APEC. He has a JD from Columbia Law School, and he was a Harlan Fiske Stone Scholar, and his BA, cum laude, from University of Pennsylvania. A hand, please, for Ambassador Gross.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you all. I've been given a small topic to talk about, which is the role of the U.S. government with regard to the past, present, and future governance of the Internet. So I'm glad you all are going to spend the next 3 years with me talking about this issue. I think it probably is fair to say that the U.S. government involvement on the Internet could be sort of summarized by saying the U.S. government created it, promoted it, defends it, and worries more about it than anybody else. And with that, I'm finished. Thank you very much. To maybe put a little more texture on that very brief summary, I have put together some slides which I'm not really going to go through, but just so that you have them, and some of you will find that this is all old information for you. But basically it goes through some of the birth of the Internet, the early growth of it, and the piece that you'll see besides the last one with Tim Berners-Lee is that the U.S. government was deeply involved in every piece of it. It really came out of U.S. government funding. And so the role of the U.S. government is one not only of thinking about it in terms of its origins, but also the DNA of the Internet. That is, the way in which the U.S. government traditionally thinks about the Internet as being a source of unprecedented ability to promote freedom, liberty, free flow of information, and so forth, is built into the DNA of the Internet because of those relationships. Similarly, the Internet as we know it, the commercial aspects, is not something that was originally thought about. Rather, as many of you know, the Internet was really designed as a way of having universities and research labs communicate with each other, computer to computer. But it was some decisions, some very forward-looking decisions, primarily during the Clinton years, that changed the nature of the Internet very substantially so that it could be commercialized, and the Internet as we know it today really is born from that. So these are some of the key dates. I put on there John Postel and the creation of IANA, largely because that's the origins for what we now think of as ICANN, and one of the key roles for ICANN. It also set up one of the key fights internationally between the U.S. government and most of the rest of the world, which I'll talk about in a moment. During the early days of the internet, it was quickly recognized that the internet is something very special. And it may seem very obvious today in a world that is so dominated by the ability to connect anyone to anyone and have the world's information on your fingertips with just the press of a couple of buttons. But this is really quite a radical, historic transformation for the world. And it was recognized by the US government very early. I would say I give great credit to the President Clinton and Vice President Gore for early on recognizing the power of the internet from a political perspective. The ability to transform the world. Now looking back, particularly after Milton's excellent presentation, you might think it's a little naive to think back, because in the early days we did not think very much about the security aspects, which helps to explain why security is not a more prominent, baked-in part of the internet. But rather, it was recognized the internet could do something very special for the world. Now, when I joined the State Department in 2001, at the very beginning of President Bush, George W. Bush's administration, the internet was already a very substantial part of the world, but really only a substantial part for the developed world. The numbers that Marilyn gave you really were a reflection of the fact that in the United States, Canada, Europe, South Korea, interestingly, Japan, and a few other places, the internet was widely adopted. But for most of the world, it was not. And that was just 15 years or so ago. And that was really brought home to me as a new person in the State Department when I had the honor of going to an African conference. And it was an unusual African conference because it was at the prime minister level and the presidential level. And it had primarily ministers from trade and ministers of finance and others, where I'm used to dealing with ministers of communications, now ICT. And I brought with me a wireless router that we bought at Costco to prove sort of how low cost. This was in 2002. And I thought I would talk about Wi-Fi and how you could have low-cost access to the internet. And my presentation was going very well, I thought. It was really, it was working. The demonstration worked well. You always worry about such things. And this conference was in Mauritius, in Africa. And a minister from trade from a country raised his hand. And he said, Ambassador Gross, you don't understand Africa. Which is true, but it was a little embarrassing. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, you don't understand Africa. In Africa, we always get technological handouts. It isn't for generations later that we get this here. Look at telephone service. There were at the time, well, a little before that time, there were as many telephone lines in Tokyo that is all of the continent of Africa. That was the statistic for about 1984, but it was still relevant then. And he says, this was a guy who was educated in the United States. He knew all about the internet, so it's not a question of that. But he said, you don't understand. We just don't get that type of technology deployed in our continent. And from a historic perspective, he's right. And he was trying to explain in the nicest possible way that what I was talking about, the economic power, the social power, the political and cultural impact of the internet was not going to be relevant to the African continent. About 2 years later, I returned to Africa and went to a similar part. And the world had changed and was completely upside down. And the reason for that was that Africa was exploding with the internet, because Africa was exploding with wireless technology. Because of the power of competition, because prices had come down, because it didn't require the types of investments that Africans had to make before in their country. And it wasn't just Africa. The same thing was going on in the Middle East. The same thing was going on in South America. The same thing was going on in Southeast Asia. A revolution was happening. And it was because of two things. One was the revolution of wireless technology. In the United States, the first wave of the internet was really based upon having a wired connection. But with the advent of 3G, 2G to some degree, but 3G particularly, starting around the year 2000, 2001, the ability to have competition, the ability to connect to the internet through wireless, even if it's rudimentary, had a profound impact. And the United States government recognized this very quickly and said, this is something important to us. Now, it was important to us for a variety of reasons. I would say number one is there was a strong sense that this could change the world. It could change the world because the US government has long felt that the key to economic prosperity and political peace is knowledge and access to knowledge. And by empowering people to have that access and that ability, that they could then use that to better themselves. History, I think, has borne that out. And although times go up and down in terms of peace and otherwise, we live in a time of extraordinary peace right now, of extraordinary prosperity right now. And a good portion, certainly not all of it, but a good portion of that is because of the technological innovations that we're talking about here. And so the U.S. interest, the governmental interest, the interest of the American people to promote those interests was recognized early and strongly. So what did the U.S. government do? It did things both to try to promote and to try to defend. As Marilyn talked about, the U.S. government and others, and certainly great credit, most credit goes to the commercial interests, they tried to explain and explore the opportunities that come to people from being connected. And at the same time, not surprisingly, many governments, came to very different conclusions. And their conclusion was, this is a danger. We don't want people to have that, because we, in government, lose some control. So, the combination of political and economic revolution that was happening in the early and mid-2000s came to a political head, at least an initial political head, in 2003 at the World Summit for the Information Society. Marilyn talked a little bit about that. This was a UN Heads of State Summit. And in the UN world, there's nothing bigger than a Heads of State Summit. That's the big thing that they do. And in typical UN fashion, there were two countries that wanted to host this. Switzerland, because they love to host these things, it fills up hotel rooms, and Tunisia. And for the life of me, I cannot tell you why Tunisia wanted to do this, but they raised their hand and they thought it was very important. And both lobbied very hard to host, and in typical UN fashion, the decision was, they'll both host. We'll do two phases. That way we don't have to make a decision and have one country be mad at us. So, to prepare for the first phase of the WSIS, the World Summit of the Information Society in 2003, we put together these large prep comps, and Marilyn touched on those. And I had the honor of leading the U.S. delegation to those meetings. And as Marilyn pointed out, most delegations did not have what we would refer to as a multi-stakeholder set of delegation. We did. We had industry representatives from the very beginning on ours, and we were the delegation, together with some in Europe, who advocated very strongly to open up that system to have the private sector, civil society, and others to participate fully in it. Why? Because we thought it was in our advantage to stack the deck with people who believed in this as compared to those governments that did not. Getting prepared to talk to you all, I had a chance to go back, the sort of advantage of these things, and look at a couple of documents from when I was leading these delegations. And I found a press report about an interview that I did when I was trying to explain what the U.S. position in that first phase at 2003 with this meeting in Geneva was. And it says that I said the following. And I think it's right. I don't really remember this, but I think it's right. So as I said, that the commitment that as nations attempt to build a sustainable ICT sector, a commitment to the private sector and rule of law must be emphasized, so that countries can attract the necessary private investment to create the infrastructure. The United States has always believed that this should be private sector led, not government led. The second pillar of what I was selling at the World Summit was the need for ongoing content creation and intellectual property rights in order to inspire ongoing content development. And interestingly, if you read reports today as to what's going on, what the barriers in the developing world are today to increasing internet penetration, it's content, local content, and the need for it in both local languages and locally identifiable, interesting subjects. And the third was ensuring security on the internet. In electronic communications and in electronic commerce is the third major priority for the United States. I'm quoted here saying, all of this works and is exciting for people as long as people feel that the networks are secure from cyber attacks, secure in terms of their privacy. Gee, that sounds very familiar. It sounds like Milton's piece. It sounds like the sort of things that people talk about today. That was in 2003. Now, what did the rest of the world care about then? What they cared about primarily was ICANN. ICANN, as you know, is an organization that was created in 1998 by the US government in order to have the names and addressing associated with the internet transferred from the US government responsibility to a non-US government entity, and the US government would continue to have a role in oversight over ICANN through a contract. And not surprisingly, governments around the world said, that's nice, but we want to do the same thing. We want to have a similar sort of connection. And why don't you share, US share? And my job was, in the nicest possible way, to say, hell no, we're not sharing it. Why did we not want to share it? Because we did not believe that China, Russia, and many other countries shared those basic values of free flow of information and of expansion of access to the internet the way we did. We thought this was a matter of national security and economic interest for the American people to promote that. Europe came to us and said, yeah, but we're not like Russia and China. Share it with us. We have the same values. And they're right. They by and large do. But the problem was, if we started to share it with one, there's no way to draw the line as to who you include in that and who do you keep out of that. So we said, thank you, but no thank you. Well, the summit came and the preparatory process was coming to a head. And as is all good things in the internet and in government relationships, we needed to punt. Because I was saying no and the rest of the world was saying yes, share. And so the decision was made, and Marilyn pointed this out. There was a decision to say, one of my talking points, by the way, was you keep talking about internet governance. I don't know what you mean by internet governance, because nobody had defined it then. So why don't we have an expert group go figure this out and report back to us for the second phase of the World Summit, which is in 2005, 2 years later. So the world said, okay, we'll put it off for 2 years, and then we're going to take the internet away from you guys and do this. Lots of work was done. Big prep comms were held, thousands of people involved. And we get up to the Tunis phase, 2005. And big shock, nothing has changed. The rest of the world wants to take the internet, at least ICANN and internet control away from the US. US is not very interested in that. And I have to tell you, I had near-death experiences in Tunisia. You may recall back in 2005, and for a few years later, Tunisia was controlled by Ben Ali, a dictator, who was a brutal dictator. Why we were in Tunisia talking about internet and internet freedom, I cannot tell you. I can tell you that I got hauled into, during the World Summit, that there were NGOs, there were civil society people there who were speaking out and were being arrested and harassed by the Tunisian authorities. The European governments came to me and to our delegation and said, this really is bad. I said, yeah, this is really bad. You should speak out. They said, yeah, why don't you speak out? and I'm slightly irrepressible, so I did. And I had the pleasure then of being called in to see the foreign minister and being yelled at by the Tunisian foreign minister for embarrassing Tunisia in their summit, which I took as a badge of honor, since I was talking about free flow of information and the need to have people be able to speak out. On the eve of the World Summit in 2005, we were at loggerheads. My job was, as I said, was to say no, hopefully in a nice way, but to say no. And the rest of the world, and I will say including Europe, was there saying no. You had to say yes, or this heads of state summit will fail. And I had two advantages over the entire rest of the world. One is my head of state, George Bush, was not coming to the summit. Their heads of state were going to the summit. Mine wasn't, so I went. And the second, I remember having this press conference, and the press was beating me up like, are you really going to let this summit fail? Because you won't agree to a compromise on letting the world share control. And I said, look, for me it's very simple. I can go home with a deal that makes sense for the United States. But I can't go home with a bad deal. I can't go home and explain to my Secretary of State, who I work for, and my President, who I work for, having changed the rules of the road on the internet. So I have a choice. I can either go home or I can't go home. And I want to go home. I'm in Tunisia. I want to go home. So I'm not going to agree to a bad deal. And at the last minute, literally the night before the beginning of the summit, the UK representative who was representing the European Commission and I got together, and I have to give him great credit. They came up with a solution that I could live with, which was the creation of the Internet Governance Forum, and for some language that identified the various roles and responsibilities on the internet for the private sector and for civil society and others. And so the Europeans and I announced that we would that we found common ground that was acceptable to the rest of the world. And the reason we were able to do the Internet Governance Forum was because we had staked out a position, the US government staked out a position long before that said we, the US, would talk to anyone, anywheres about the internet because we wanted to promote it. And those were the key things. So we saw the Internet Governance Forum as being a continuation of the discussion. Now, I will share with you that when I made that deal and I reported back to the US delegation, which had a lot of private sector and civil society people and others in there, they thought I was crazy, and they were very unhappy with me. And they were very unhappy because they said, we're just going to keep relitigating this same set of issues over and over again of Internet governance control. And I assured them that we had put in the word no a lot into the language that we had agreed to, that there would be no decision-making. This would not be a decision-making meeting. And it's ironic, to some degree, that the very groups that were most concerned about the creation of the Internet Governance Forum, when I announced it, civil society, companies, academics, and others, are the ones who are most enthusiastic about the Internet Governance Forum today. So it proves that how things change over time, because people, in fact, saw the value. Let me fast forward, having survived the World Summit of the Information Society in 2005. Fast forward, we've had a series of meetings globally where the U.S. government's been actively involved at the ITU, at the United Nations, and importantly, during the Obama administration in 2014, they announced that if certain criteria were met, that the continuing role of the U.S. government with regard to the ICANN would be discontinued. And those criteria were met. And then in 2016, the U.S. government no longer had that contractual relation with ICANN. So from 2005, when we had said no, because we did not think that was possible, to 2016, there was a sea change. And one which I and many others very firmly supported. So the U.S. government role throughout this process has been its creation of the Internet, the promotion of the Internet, the promotion of the Internet economically, globally, and politically, and to defend it against those who would seek to have fundamental changes made to the way in which the Internet operates. Today, this continues to be an important set of issues. They have not gone away. One would argue, in fact, they are harder, more interesting, more challenging than ever before. The U.S. government is very actively involved today in those issues. And I would say, although we were always involved in cybersecurity as part of the Internet governance piece, today cybersecurity is an even much more substantial piece of this, both because of concerns about offensive use of the Internet against interests globally, as well as the ability to promote U.S. interests from a global perspective. The challenges today, as you all know, are greater than ever before. We saw that in 2016, because now the challenges, as Milton and Marilyn talked a little bit about this morning, no longer are just technical, but they're about how information is used, how information is disseminated, what people do with it. And those are very difficult challenges. They're not challenges that are fixed by finding new code. They're not challenges determined by how you can make some technological fix. These are challenges to each and every person to be able to figure out what is and is not truthful, what is and is not relevant and important. And so we go back to first principles, education. We go back to understanding it is about the individual and the role of the individual in using this technology. And those are the key things that I believe will drive Internet innovation, drive Internet adoption, and drive Internet as a force for good, as it has for the past 25 years or so, in ways that will change the world. Let me just end with one thought. One of the problems about the internet, I think, has been that people seem to focus so much on the problems. And by problems, I don't just mean the internet, but the world is full of problems. There are wars, there are famines, there are an endless number of things to worry about. And yet, today, we live in the most peaceful time in human history. We live in a time of economic prosperity unlike anything anybody has ever seen in human history. We live in a time with the highest literacy in human history by orders of magnitude. We live in a time of longevity that is profoundly different than our grandparents and our great-grandparents had. And I don't mean just in the United States or in Europe, but the greatest changes that I'm talking about has happened and is happening in the developing world. There's a great book out that I'm reading that talks about this, called Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress by Steven Pinker, professor at Harvard. And it is full of the most extraordinary statistics. And being a psychologist, he explains why it is we humans seem to always see the downside rather than the upside. Even though if you stand back, the upside is so tremendous. And it's really something profoundly different for our generation than for all of human history. And one of the reasons for that, and there are many reasons, but one of the primary reasons for that is the internet. And the profound impact the internet has had on individuals, on those in academia who conspire and work with each other, for the political changes that have happened, and in fact for the knowledge that people have about the world around them. That is something that needs defending, that is something that needs promoting, and that is in fact the cause for all of us to rally around. Thank you very much. All right, time for questions or lunch? Question?
Yes.
Oh, also, I'm supposed to give you this microphone.
Oh.